Welcome to the Fourth Branch program. Glad you can make it. I am MD. This program is dedicated exclusively for those with common sense, a spirit of patriotism, and a determination for a more perfect union. Stay tuned as we begin the discussion of a very important, interesting, and enlightening topic. Hope to hear from you soon. Happy listening. Hello everyone, my name is Mike Duchenne, MD for short. Welcome to the Fourth Branch program. Today we have a special edition of Race Relation in America, as well as the discussion of the jeopardy our democracy is facing. The past 2 years, we have had a very tumultuous administration in the Oval Office. No, not because Donald Trump is incompetent, although that contributes to that. Not because he surrounded himself with people who do not challenge him when he's wrong. That did not help either. Not because he is a liar. That also diminishes the office of the presidency, obviously, but rather because the legislative branch, which was fully controlled by the Republicans, did absolutely nothing to steer the country in the right direction. They all, emphasis on all, relinquished their duty as protectors of the nation, as the branch responsible to make certain the integrity of our nation is safeguarded, even when we have an executive branch running amok. None of that happened. The 2018 midterm election, however, we did have a glimmer of hope. The citizens of the country, those who are concerned about the state of affairs in the country, came out to put a little bit of checks into the executive branch. We gave us a little bit of hope. Just earlier, the Democrat elected Mrs. Pelosi as the House Speaker. Although we do not expect a miracle to happen, but we do hope that this new year will bring much of the checks that are needed in order to keep the country in the right direction. No longer will Donald Trump be able to do anything he wants without any checks from the legislative branch. Yes, he still has the power to elect judges, incompetent judges, because the senators will just zoom those judges through the nomination. However, we are more or less certain that Congress will do its job and will give us some semblance of normalcy in the country. Welcome to 2019. there is no doubt that the election of Trump to the Oval Office has contributed a great deal to the erosion of our democracy. More on that later. The trend itself has been slowly, gradually shaking the system which has made America the envy of the world. Even without the presidency of Donald Trump, it was all too obvious that politicians in general, Republican legislators in particular, have worked systematically to chip away at our democracy. For more than 4 decades now, Republican leaders, assisted by pundits like Fox, Rush, and Coulter, and so on, have floated the idea that of voters' fraud, an idea that was debunked over and over and over again by more than 2 decades, 20 years of historical data. While they were propagandized voters' fraud behind the scene, they were working aggressively to undermine the election system, otherwise known as election fraud. You see, as of this conversation, in North Carolina, the 9th district election happened. But the outcome cannot be certified. The reason was very simple. Republican candidate Mark Harris was caught, at least his campaign was caught, destroying ballots, eliminating all votes that were not favorable to him. He is currently under investigation. And according to the latest reporting, this was not just a fluke. It was not just an error or some minor mistake. It was a deliberate attempt by Mark Harris and team to literally, quote unquote, steal the election. Republicans have been up in arms for the past few decades, accusing Democrats of voters' fraud. Again, something that's proven by more than 2 decades worth of data. Voter fraud just simply is non-existent. Maybe they know because they were able to get away with what they were doing, which is election fraud. So they assume that the other side has to be doing something wrong as well. Now, the problem that I just mentioned that happened in North Carolina was not an isolated case. In Georgia, for instance, Brian Kemp, who was the Secretary of State, whose job was to certify the election, ran for the governorship of the state. Mr. Kemp was caught right before the 2018 midterm election, purging more than 50,000 votes, more than 50,000 voters' record, most of which belong to people in the minority, blacks and Hispanic. Mr. Kemp did not expect to get blacks or Hispanic vote. Now, this particular instance was nullified by a judge. So Mr. Kemp was ordered to put back those voters that he purged. A small matter for Mr. Kemp because for the past 2 years before the election, it is reported that more than 1 million record of voters were purged. Mr. Kemp must have been working very hard for this particular 2018 midterm election. Now, why is that important? Well, it is important because there are only two major aspects of a democracy. One, it is to vote to elect officials, people to represent our views, people to speak on our behalf. And the other is, of course, freedom of speech. Election fraud nullify the first one. In other words, my vote would not matter. Your vote would not matter because someone would simply make certain that it just doesn't matter that you vote for somebody else because they would make it just irrelevant. It is a practice that we see mostly in authoritarian regime, in dictatorship type of government with a semblance of democracy. Now, according to the official record for that particular election in North Carolina, the 9th district that is, Mark Harris would have won the election by 905 votes. It is very safe to say he didn't win the election because the number of votes that have been eliminated, the number of ballots that have been thrown away, there are too many of them for those 905 votes to be of any relevance. Now, has Mark not been caught, he would have been sent to Washington to represent those residents in the 9th district. In other words, those who did not vote for Mark Harris, the majority who did not vote for Mark Harris would not have their representation in Washington accordingly. Put differently, their votes would not have mattered. In other words, the hell with democracy. So the idea that we are a country which has been promoting democracy across the world has been undermined for the past few decades by the same party, the Republican Party, who has been accusing the Democrat with no proof whatsoever of fraud, of voters' fraud. And ironically, Republicans have been caught over and over and over committing election fraud. The GOP is compromised. Why is that important? If your idea of democracy is simply to have someone that you like getting elected, irrespective of the system, then it probably doesn't matter to you. But it should, because if you go down that path, it simply means that when it is the other side doing it, we are eroding our system of democracy. To preserve our democracy, we should be loyal to the country first, not to a party, not to an individual. The individual will be gone at some point. The party will change, as it has many times. But our democracy must continue to exist. And the very fact that Republicans have been involved in election fraud in order to keep a majority, in order to get elected, irrespective of the damage done to our system of democracy, should be of concern to any patriot. And the reason is simple. If we let it happen, if we do not fix the problem, sooner or later, the United States will no longer be a democracy. If we lose the ability to have our votes counted, the next best thing that's left for us, the freedom of speech, will also be quelched. Because anyone who can manipulate the election can decide to do anything he or she wants as far as our freedom. Already, you've seen it. Donald Trump has declared a war on freedom of speech. He had consistently, permanently going after the media, calling it fake news, which should be chilling to anyone who is an American patriot. Adolf Hitler did exactly that in order to delegitimize the media. And he did. So it is of no comfort to anyone, no matter where you stand, no matter who you support, no matter how much you like an individual. Ron Paul, the fathers of Rand Paul say, true patriotism requires that we oppose the government when it is wrong. When you have a government, whether it's the president of the United States, a senator, a congressman, a governor, a mayor, when we have an elected official who is doing something which jeopardizes our democracy, it is time for everyone, no matter which political party you belong to unite to get rid of that individual. Because no individual is important enough to jeopardize what we have, our freedom, our democracy. It is way too important. And as it stands today, much damage has been done by the Republicans, who would stop at absolutely nothing in order to keep a majority, in order to stay in power. This is not what the United States of America is about. It is unfortunate, however, that there are millions of those individuals who do not have the understanding that it is way more important to preserve our democracy, to be loyal to the country instead of to an individual. We've seen happening right now that millions of people continue to support Donald Trump despite having displayed no concern for the United States of America. He speaks a lot. He said that he does, but we know Donald Trump doesn't say anything that is true. And thus far, after 2 years as president of the United States, we've seen the outcome. The question I always ask to anyone who think it's hatred for Donald Trump that people oppose him. Here's the question. Would you use Donald Trump as role model for your children? Program, inviting you to join me every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. and every weekday at 2 p.m. for discussions of social political issues and to dissect the meaning and the importance of current events, as well as to understand topics of legislations. The Fourth Branch Project is not associated with any political party, and we at the Fourth Branch do not have any political agenda or aspiration. Our ultimate objective is to work towards achieving a more perfect union by removing ignorance, the biggest obstacle to our democracy. Join me on our next social media broadcast. See you then. The level of ignorance of a people is the most accurate gauge to determine the strength of democracy in any country. In other words, when you look at a country and you look at the intelligence, the smart of that country, you get a sense as to whether democracy in that country is strong or weak. The past 2 years has proven that here in the United States of America, we have millions of individuals who are ignorant. Marcus Cicero said that any man can make mistakes, but only an idiot will persist in his error. Unfortunately, here in the United States, we have seen in the past 2 years that individuals who have made the mistakes of supporting Donald Trump because they thought it would be a different individual, of supporting Donald Trump because they thought, well, he would change. He would become someone who is interesting in the well-being of the country. Now, those individuals can see without any type of ambiguity that it is not so. As such, it is impossible to understand why they would continue to support an individual who proves to be nothing but what they expected. So when a conversation about Donald Trump shows up or is on the way, the question is, would you use Donald Trump as your role model? Hold that thought. Hi, I am MD, host of the Fourth Branch program. War on Blacks is a new topic added to the Fourth Branch programming in order to discuss the intricacies, the complexities of race relations in America. The goal is threefold. 1, to bring attention to the various forms of prejudice, discriminations, and racism in the country. 2, to expose the undeniable presence of such in every aspect of life and every corner of our society. 3, to extricate us all from the ignorance, the indifference, or the complicity. The ultimate objective is to make the discussions of those issues, racism, prejudice, discrimination, a normal part of our lives. then and only then will we as a society be able to eradicate the problem. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." Abraham Joshua Heschel exclaimed, "Racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum of hatred for the minimum of reason." Join me in the journey to restore equality. Or would you please get out of the way? Thank you. Race relation in America. For those of you who were not with me last year, I will take the opportunity to give you a primer on war on blacks. We began the discussion earlier in the week talking about race relation in America, prejudice, discrimination, racism. We also mentioned that the reason that it is so difficult to find a solution is because everybody has been avoiding those issues. Blacks feel uncomfortable talking about it because it is an emotional topic to talk about, especially if you know the history. Whites avoid to talk about it because, well, it's offensive to them, because it's offensive to them, because it is offensive to them. They don't want to hear about it. They don't care who caused it. They don't care. If you ask every single white individual as to whether he or she is racist or discriminate, the answer will most likely be no. Except, of course, for the few white nationalists and KKK. But in general, you will get a no answer because nobody wants to admit that he or she is racist or he or she discriminates. And yet, discrimination, racism, rampant in the United States. So how do you reconcile those two? Now, if you are asked, if you think you are not racist or you do not discriminate, and we go down the line across the country and we find that it's the exact same answer, then we have a problem. How do you get a problem, a social issue that widespread in the country, and yet nobody wants to be accountable for it? As such, we decided at the Fall Branch to tackle the issue head on. And that will help not only establish some ground rules, some background, a basis for the discussion of race relation in America, but it also will make the discussion more easier. Now, it's not going to be comfortable, but it makes it easier because the more you talk about, the more you flesh out the problem, the better it is at finding a solution, because unless you know the problem, unless you acknowledge the problem, you cannot get a solution for the problem. So first, we have to say, yes, there is a problem, and it is caused by the very predicament that we just mentioned. Now, in order to understand, we'll explain war on black in a short little, shortly. In order to understand, we have to go as far back as slavery. Now, when we left off last year, we left discussing slavery and the beginning of the rebellion. And we will pick on that very shortly as we continue the conversation about race relation in America. So during slavery, we had two groups of individuals. We have first, we have a side where we only have whites, slave owners. They buy, sell blacks, and they use them to enrich themselves. Blacks were property, just like a real estate. Now, at the same time, we had groups of whites who did not like the idea, who did not subscribe to the idea, who actually fought against the idea. So there were always two groups of white in this country. And it so happened that at some point, slavery was eradicated. Slavery was eliminated. Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Act and proclaimed slavery over. So that should have put an end to everything, right? That should have made everything fine, because from that point, then we should say that, yes, there was slavery. Now the president of the United States signed an executive order, put an end to slavery, then blacks were free, then there should be no more problem. In fact, that actually was just the beginning of problem that blacks were gonna face right here in the United States of America. And the reason for that is because the groups of whites who enrich themselves using blacks, free labor, cheap labor, to enrich themselves, they buy land, they buy houses, they send their kids to the best school, they wore the best clothes, and so on and so forth, and they accumulated wealth and passed down from one generation to the next, and that makes them feel comfortable. Think of it as someone who has a source of revenue, and then all of a sudden the government comes and say, well, you cannot use that anymore. And that's the way that those white Southerners, that's the way that they felt. Well, we're fine with that. We're fine with blacks being slaves because, well, they help us stay rich. They help us send our kids to school. The hell with blacks. We don't care about what comes of them. So when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Act, now they thought, well, we cannot let that happen. We have to keep black slaves. So those whites, they fought with their lives. That's why we had the Civil War in this country from 1861 to 1865. So they fought with their lives to keep slavery around. By the same token, there were also whites on the other side who fought to end slavery. Those whites were assisted by black who also obviously wanted slavery to end. So on one side you had whites only, and on the other side you had both whites and blacks. One side, the whites only, fighting to keep slavery, and on the other side, whites and black fighting to end slavery. Now, if you think about it for one moment, the war on blacks have been actually started well before the slavery part, because the individuals who went to Africa to chase and capture blacks, they started that war from there on their own turf. People who were living their lives, who did not bother anybody. Now you have a group of whites who came, who see them as merchandise, ran after them, capture them if possible, if not, kill them. The War on Blacks, that title was not used, that banner was not used for slogan purpose. It was used to point to the fact that blacks have been casualties since the whole process of human integration began. For reasons that beyond their power, because they were living their lives, they didn't bother anybody, and here came a group of whites armed with rifles chasing people who did not bother them, and capture them, torture them, chain them, and then sold them. Yes, war on blacks is appropriate for what we are talking about, because the casualties have been mounting and it's been pretty much almost one-sided. Now, fast forward to here in the United States of America, blacks sold as slaves, traded, tortured, work 18 hours a day. The same black that today you hear when whites, especially those who are racist, are talking about blacks being lazy. Those same white slave owners, former slave owners, or descendant of slave owners, those are the same people that today they do not hesitate a second to label blacks as lazy. Unbelievable. Blacks were on the field working 18 plus hours a day. And if they show any sign of fatigue, they were beaten until they bled. They got tortured. Sometimes they got their limb cut in order to teach them a lesson, in order to instill fear on the others, and they were starved to death. That was the predicament. The war on blacks have been ongoing and it has not ended. Now, those same individuals, the same white Southerners who fought to keep slavery around, they're the same one who have been fighting to keep prejudice, discrimination, and racism alive here in America. Now, it is more difficult to find out, as I mentioned yesterday. It's because in the past, it was easy to just point to the South and say, oh, slave owners, descendants of slave owners, we know where they live, we know what they look like, and so on. No longer is that possible, because with migration, transportation all across the country, there is no way to know where those whites who are racist and those who discriminate, there is no way to find out where they're at. But as I started to explain, the casualty that they have inflicted on blacks did not end at the end of slavery. Those are during slavery, and even as of date, we're still talking about the same thing. During slavery, there were physical casualty. We still have that when a police officer just unloaded his weapon on an unarmed black man. Same idea, kill a black man, no accountability. During slavery, that was the exact same thing. Now, there was no justice system for anybody to go to. So a slave owner kill a black, there is nobody to report that to, because the black was a property. So they could do anything that they wanted with their property. Today, because we have a semblance of a justice system, when a police officer unloads his weapon on an unarmed black man, there is a semblance, some sort of justice system where the police officer went and then they just do a bunch of activities, and then the police officer is released as not guilty. He was in his right to kill the black man. There is absolutely no difference whatsoever. Today, there is a semblance that something is happening, but the same outcome. The former slave owner could kill black slave without any accountability. Today, the police officer simply say, I was afraid for my life. Now, here's why this system is preserved. Blacks, slave, beyond the emancipation, nothing has changed. White continue to control everything. And by everything, we mean every aspect of society controlled by white. Now, understandably so, because all blacks were slaves. It is reported that in the 18th century, that 1/3 of the population in the South was black slave. 1/3. That is a huge number for an area in our country. But they were all slaves. Now, because of the predicament, of course, as slave, you had absolutely nothing. You, a slave, you are not entitled to anything. And black and white made certain that blacks, at some point, especially, it's something that we will address in even further detail, that when they found out that a country in the Caribbean, Haiti, managed to kick the French, who occupied that part of America, and the blacks there managed to kick the French out. Here in America, there was a lot of panic among the whites, because suddenly they feel, if that happened and the French get kicked out, and remember, during that time period of colonialism, those individuals, they had firepower, so to speak. They had a rifle. They have ways to kill effectively. But the blacks that they captured from Africa, they didn't have any way of fighting because they had no weapon. Of course, along the way, if they escaped, they could manage to get their hands on something. But from the time that they were captured from Africa, brought to either here in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, all those places, blacks were chained and watched. Now, if they had to move about during the time that they were forced to work 18 hours a day, they had people watching them with rifle. So they stood no chance to escape. And some even try to, because they rather die than continue to be subjected to that predicament. So once they get the privilege, the opportunity to have the chain removed, even if they know they were going to be killed, they would run to escape, and hoping that two things would happen. Either they would be free or they would be killed. Either way, they prefer the outcome. So, to get back to the predicament on war on blacks, when Abraham Lincoln signed the executive order, the Emancipation Act, then automatically it translated as war for those whites who own slaves, who believe that this is their way of getting richer and richer. And then here there was the president of the United States says, no more. Now, none of those people could take a look at, and by the way, they were Christian. And that's the other side of the story, that as we continue to discuss this aspect of the hypocrisy of morality in those who want to convey the idea that they have a higher level of morality, and yet everything that shows just the opposite is what they do. Now, today, it is understandable that you weren't there during slavery. If you're white, even if your ancestors were slave owners, now it is very obvious that you weren't there. Slavery ended officially in 1865. After the Civil War ended, of course, the Emancipation Act was passed in 1862, 1863, but the Civil War make it such as if that those things were still ongoing. But when the war ended, and those on the white side, those who were fighting to keep slavery around, lost. Now, for all purpose of conversation, you would have said, okay, this is the end of it. And you would have thought for people who went to church, who presumably have the love of God, who would understand that human beings are not supposed to be treated the way that they were treating slaves, and yet they didn't feel that way. Because as far as those white racists were concerned, they don't care. They just have to have free labor, cheap labor, and people they could mistreat and not have to account to anybody. Now, following that, now we're going to use 1865 as the end of slavery, although in reality that's not the case, because we have historical data that shows us that even up to 1960, there were some blacks who were still slaves in the United States. Now, granted, it was not widespread, but nevertheless, we do have data that shows that. But we're going to use, for sake of the discussion, 1865 as end of slavery. Abraham Lincoln said, no more slaves are free, signed the act, Civil War happened, whites who wanted slavery around lost, then slavery ended. Now, while this sounds like great news for the blacks, great news for those who fought to end slavery, but the struggle, the war on black had just begun. Because whites exclusively owned, controlled everything. No matter where you look, no matter what you look at, no matter which aspect of our society you looked at, everything was owned and controlled by whites. But even worse, those who wanted to keep slavery around, those who discriminate, they in control of everything. Now, you may not understand the predicament, but for blacks, this is major issues because, yes, they could jump up and down. They were no longer slaves. But there was nothing to jump up and down about because they were stripped of everything they had, even their health, even their strength. Some of them may have walked away with missing limb because their white slave owners had to teach them a lesson. Some of them walk away not even healthy because they were sick, working 18 hours a day every single day. This is not a joke. Even if you do it for a day or two at your job for whatever the reason would be, in order to meet a deadline or whatever the case is, you would see how tired it is. Now, picture an individual who had to do that daily and not sitting in an office, not sitting at a desk, but in the field with sun beaming on your back, the scorching sun or the chilling cold. That was the predicament for blacks. It's physical war, psychological war, emotional war, financial war. Blacks suffer all the casualties. Now, we did point out another very emotional and psychological war that especially women slaves were going through, that we will have a chance to touch on as we continue this conversation. But we want to give you a sense as to why discrimination is so rampant in the United States and who is fueling that. And why every time a black falls victim of the system, you have a few people, as if those people were put there for that purpose. They part of the whole movie. They come on TV, on all stations, talking about the need for better race relation between blacks and white for a couple of days, and then all that dissipates until the next casualty of a black individual. It's almost like it's well orchestrated here in the United States. Now, whether it is or not, I'm not in a position to say, but it happened. It happened so uniformly that you would say that this is something that been rehearsed many times and waiting for the opportunity to come and make and play for the grand public. But the situation for the blacks has not changed. Now, the whites, beyond slavery, own everything. So blacks could not get a job, not even a menial job. Because whites, especially in the South, they made certain of that. Because they make certain that blacks continue to suffer even beyond slavery. Now, think about that for just a moment. You weren't there during slavery. Your great-great-great-grandparent may have been a kid. So, or may have been just at the end of slavery, or may have even be a young man or a young woman. So you weren't born yet. That is understood. But you cannot wash your hands of slavery just because you weren't there, especially if you are white and you're a descendant of slave owners. You are as responsible of the current predicament in the country as the slave owners were. And the reason for that is because the slave owners, your ancestors, deprived blacks of everything. And even beyond slavery, they also were responsible to put obstacles, stumbling blocks, lack of opportunity for blacks. So they continue the war on blacks beyond slavery. Yes, you weren't there, but your ancestors worked aggressively, systematically to make certain that blacks stay in their place. Now, they weren't doing just that. They were waging war on blacks on many fronts. Closing opportunities, no financial opportunities. And as we continue, you're going to see why, if you take a black and a white and you put them side by side, even today, it will be even harder for the black to jump to the next opportunity in comparison to the white. Yes, you weren't there during slavery. We acknowledge that. We understand that. But you are not responsible even indirectly, if you are a descendant of slave owners, you are very much part of the problem of discrimination and racism in the country. And you cannot just shrug it off or wash your hand as if you have absolutely nothing to do with it. Because your ancestors set a system which put blacks in the predicaments blacks are in today. They close financial opportunities, they close education, they close every aspect for blacks. That's why you see a lot of blacks migrated from the south to the north. So the blacks you see across the street or a few blocks down the street from you who are poor, who cannot read or write, who you may look at as what are those people doing with their lives, you could be indirectly responsible for their predicament because your ancestors put them in that predicament. And the situation continued this way because with the process of setting those type of walls, barrier, gates, and so on, were not being done just physically because they were working, as I mentioned earlier, in many fronts. And one of the most effective war that your ancestors had waged against black is the information war. Because what was passed from your great grandfather down the line all the way to you is mis and disinformation about blacks. It's what I call blaming the victim. Whites, slave owners, they did terrible, horrific harm to blacks. But when the Emancipation Act was passed, any logical individual would have seen, gee, what are we doing? You would have thought a logical individual would have stepped back and said, gosh, what did we do to those people? No, that's not what happened. We already know that. Slave owners fought with their lives to keep slavery. So they never saw what they were doing was wrong. In fact, they fought with their life to keep it. Because they thought, well, that makes us rich. That gives us stature. So why should we get rid of that? So when slavery ended, they continued to fight the war against black differently. As history tells us that whites, even beyond slavery, were still able to do a lot of harm, physical harm to blacks without any accountability. We have example for you, which we'll address as we come next week when we continue with the conversation about the rebellion. So whites who wanted to keep slavery around wake up and find out after almost 5 years of war, they lost, but they changed the strategy. Okay, we cannot have blacks as slaves anymore, but we're going to make sure, we're going to make certain they have the most difficult lives they ever had, as if they didn't have enough. blaming the victims. Whites who are racist, whites who discriminate have been doing that for the longest. The war on blacks have been ongoing in America for the longest. So it's almost as if they believe that blacks did something to them. They're the one who enslaved blacks, who tortured them, who starved them to death, who cut their limb, who inflicted them horrific punishment. But when the opportunity was presented for blacks to be free, they turn it around and say, well, we are the victims here. So this is not new, what's currently going on in the United States of America whenever you're talking about interaction between blacks and white. After victimizing blacks, you will always hear just the opposite. They the victim here. That's why, as I've been mentioning, and I will continue to mention it, every time that a black is gunned down, executed by a police officer on the street, and blacks react by protesting against that, against police brutality, you tune into Fox, you will see that Fox actually is blaming the victim. All their hosts, they gang up, and the person who is responsible for the problem is the victim. That's something that's been going on. That war on blacks has been going on for the longest. It started in the South. And now there is a medium for that war to continue. So this is not hyperbole. The war on black is not hyperbole. It's real. For blacks, it is real. When Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman, Sean Hannity invited him to come and talk about how great life is. Raise money for him. He is the victim there. He was the victim. Yes, when a black falls victim of tragedy in the hands of a white individual, it is almost certain you tune into Fox and you will find out that the individual who is victimized now is victimized again. This is how our society has set it up. It started during slavery. The slave owners, they found comfort in blaming the very individual they were inflicting horrific harm on. All of a sudden, they see themselves as the victim. And Fox picked up the mantle. And now you can rest assured that blacks protesting police brutality are going to be the one being bashed on Fox. Now I want to make certain this is understood, that we know there are two groups in the United States of America. Two groups of whites. There are millions of whites who are racist, who discriminate, and there are millions of whites who are not racist, who do not discriminate. We already established that, and we'll continue to mention it, but we cannot live as if it is just a few people. It's not just a few people. It's not just the white nationalists. It's not just the KKK. These people, the group who comprise those people, very small, extremely small. Yes, they make a lot of noise because they want the spotlight, but it is a small group. Racism, discrimination is alive in the United States, not because of the white nationalists. not because of the KKK. It is much alive because it is widespread in the United States of America. We have one interesting way of finding that out, and it has been on display over and over and over. It is very much ingrained in the Republican Party. And you will find, as I provided many examples, which I will continue to provide, that actions, legislation, laws passed are geared almost exclusively to be detrimental to blacks. So the war on blacks did not end at the end of slavery. It continues. And as such, casualties have been mounting. Yes, casualties, physical, emotional, psychological, financial casualties have been mounting. There is no denying the problem in the country. The difficulty, obviously, is the fact that you cannot meet an individual, a white individual, on the street, at the supermarket, in school, at your workplace, in the government. You cannot just meet them and know that he or she is racist or not. But watch what they say, watch their actions. Within 2 minutes, I'll say 5, of spending time and talking to a white individual, I can tell you without any ambiguity whether that person is racist or not. Because the essence of an individual cannot be hidden for long. People speak, and the Bible says we speak out of the abundance of our heart. So no matter how much someone tries to hide who they are, it will come out within a few minutes. You just have to be conscious and watch what they say, and mostly their action. Because what they say is only half the story. Because people may say things that may have no value, or they may say things just to hurt someone. And that may just be temporary. Of course, that could be racist, hurt, but that person may not necessarily be a racist, may just want to hurt an individual. But the essence of a human being is revealed very quickly when you're interacting with others. So the idea that racism and discrimination is only on the fringe, there are not that many people doing it, untrue. It is widespread in the United States of America. And there are tons of examples, and those we will continue to bring forth and discuss as we continue the conversation on race relation in America. Hi, I am MD, host of the Fourth Branch program. War on Blacks is a new topic added to the Fourth Branch programming in order to discuss the intricacies, the complexities of race relations in America. The goal is threefold. 1, to bring attention to the various forms of prejudice, discriminations, and racism in the country. 2. To expose the undeniable presence of such in every aspect of life and every corner of our society. 3. To extricate us all from the ignorance, the indifference, or the complicity. The ultimate objective is to make the discussions of those issues, racism, prejudice, discrimination, a normal part of our lives. Then, and only then, will we, as a society, be able to eradicate the problem. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." Abraham Joshua Heschel exclaimed, "Racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum of hatred for the minimum of reason." Join me in the journey to restore equality. Or would you please get out of the way? Thank you. I do thank you for spending the time with me. It is a way of being part of the solution. If you have questions, criticism, suggestion, please do not hesitate to contact us. If you'd like to see other topics discussed here on the 4th Branch program, do send us a request. We will research it, we will discuss it, and we will debate it. As we always mention, we do not have a political agenda. Our only objective is to educate and remove ignorance on particular topics, hoping that will help to advance our society, to improve relationship in our society. As such, your participation is absolutely necessary. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Join me again next time. Good day. I am MD, host of the 4th Branch program, inviting you to join me every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. and every weekday at 2 p.m. for discussions of social, political issues and to dissect the meaning and the importance of current events, as well as to understand topics of legislations. The 4th Branch Project is not associated with any political party, and we at the 4th Branch do not have any political agenda or aspiration. Our ultimate objective is to work towards achieving a more perfect union by removing ignorance, the biggest obstacle to our democracy. Join me on our next social media broadcast. See you then. Fourth Branch podcast is brought to you in collaboration with the People Branch publication, which can be found on the People Branch website located at peoplebranch.org. That's peoplebranch.org. That's peoplebranch.org website, in which you will find a number of very interesting articles. My name is Mike Duchesne, MD for short. I hope you have a great afternoon or a great evening, whichever it happens to be. Hopefully you can join me again next time for another interesting episode of this podcast. That was the Fourth Branch, live from New York. Good day.